debating Mo Mowlam's good points and bad points, but that was a very favourable portrait, and so it should be. But let's face it, the Unionists hated her, and the British government sidelined her. So, I mean, there's more than one side to Mo Mowlam. Let's start with the British government, Paul Murphy. I mean, she very much felt that she'd been completely left out of the loop.
I didn't sideline her, that's for sure. And that's a very moving account there of her life. And I think that whatever happened eventually to Mo in terms of going to another cabinet position or whatever it might be, my view is that she was pivotal in the success of the Good Friday Agreement. And, you know, I went to the House of Commons exactly the same day as Mo, and we were firm friends before we both came to Northern Ireland. And everybody on this stage will remember individually what she did. But, you know, some people argued, for example, that standing ovation what meant things were difficult from after that. I'm not quite so convinced about that. And certainly things changed eventually, but in that pivotal, important period between the general election of 1997 and the signing of the agreement, and indeed the referendum that we saw there, I was sitting next to her when she made that announcement, I think all would agree that her work was, and her contribution was absolutely outstanding.
Reg MP, I don't quite know your personal feelings, but David Trimble did not like Mo Mowlam.
No,
was that a personal thing, or was it because he perceived the way he perceived the work she was doing?
Well, it was a bit of both. I mean, to say that we hated her is a gross exaggeration. I mean, I always got on reasonably well with her. But I think people perhaps don't understand that our dealings with government
I think that David Trimble made it clear that he would not talk to her, he would only talk directly to the Prime Minister.
We had very few dealings with her, that's the truth.
She was the Secretary of State.
Most of it was done. Mo was not a detailed person. Mo was a big picture person, and we were aware she was very popular. She had very many attributes. She had a huge cross to carry herself, personally, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But just to put it into context, whenever the Prime Minister came into Castle Buildings, he came in not only with his own immediate entourage, he even brought his own word process operators with him. I mean, the whole local team was just pushed out completely. And even the space was taken up by the Downing Street team, who really took over everything. And when the Prime Minister was in the building, the Northern Ireland office folk were obviously to some extent displaced to a point, apart from those who were directly engaged, like Paul, in the process. But no, there's no question of doubt the relationship was frosty and difficult. And that can happen in politics, but it didn't divert us from the task of trying to get an agreement.
Dawn.
Yeah, I disagree with what you said about unionists disliking.
Oh, I meant the Ulster Unionist Party.
Well, the Ulster
Sorry,
Unionist
I beg
Party,
your pardon.
because certainly my own party and David's party, we thought Mo was a gem, and she couldn't be any more different from the previous Secretary of State, Sir Patrick Mayhew. And they were like night and day in our dealings with them. Mo, as you know, was ill and had to wear a wig at times. But she ran about, she took the wig off, she patted it, she said, "You stay there, I'll come back to you in a minute." She ran about in her bare feet, and she was no nonsense. And she wanted to get in, she wanted to talk about the issues, and she wanted to try and resolve them. And I think she had a unique ability to engage with people at all levels, and went from room to room, wondering what was going on, how people were getting on, and just trying to create human relationships with people. And I don't know about the relationship between herself and the Ulster Unionist Party, but certainly I can talk from my own experience. And we had a fantastic relationship with her. We could go to her with any issue, and she would go out of her way to try and resolve it, or go and talk to another party and see if we could try and resolve the issue through some sort of dialogue or through bilaterals, or she would be the mediator. And we just found her a breath of fresh air in terms of direct rule ministers in Northern Ireland.
Well, Monica, very briefly, please.
Well, the other wonderful thing about Mo, and there are many representatives here in the audience today from the community, was that Mo knew that there wasn't just a peace process, there were peace processes. And she was out all the time building information from the community and feeding that into the process. And she was also asking parties to feed that. And I remember from time to time Senator Mitchell because it was a hothouse atmosphere, you weren't so familiar with what was going on outside. And Mo was juggling all of that. I would disagree, Reg, that she wasn't a person for detail, because she was taking so much information in and paying attention to things that others weren't. And in those last days when the deal was being cut, and once we got over the north-south borders issue, or the implementation bodies issue, she was very fixed on the need for a comprehensive agreement, the issue of reconciliation, what we were going to do about victims as well as prisoner releases, what we were going to do in terms of policing. And Mo, I remember distinctly, that night from about 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock, running up and down the corridors between the parties with no wig, a drip in her arm for peeing, and on her bare feet.
Right.
And the woman was exhausted, but she was so optimistic and so positive. And it was that kind of atmosphere that I think we should remember, and she should not, as David Andrews said, ever become a footnote in what led up to the negotiations.
Well, thank you, Monica. We'll leave that issue there. Taoiseach, Jonathan Powell talks about you wanting to plant one on David Trimble at one stage late in the week after he had allegedly been rude to you. I mean, could I ask you, I mean, in your negotiations with the various parties, who did you like best, who did you like least?
Well, we won't get into that. But
I'll go on.
I'll just say this, Noel. I mean, in all of the meetings that we had, and I know sometimes some of the parties might have felt isolated, but Tony Blair and I genuinely tried to keep everybody informed. We tried to meet the groups. Obviously, if there was an issue that affected two parties rather than other parties, at the time wasn't equal. And we had some right ding-dongs, and there was a fair level of abuse during the talks and after the talks. I remember some of the meetings after the Good Friday Agreement where it continued on at the same level. But I mean, all of the way through it, sometimes listen to what we're all saying now. You can forget when we came to Castle Buildings for that last 7 months, or for the last, I mean, the trouble started at the level we were dealing with in 68, effectively. 88, the start of the efforts to find a peace process started off quietly. And then Albert Reynolds, my leader at the time, and John Major, the British government leader, they took it onto a phase. So then we get to 1998. I mean, the discussions have been going on for a decade, and now we're looking back at a decade. So it's been a very long process, a huge amount of people involved in it. And I think that the big thing for us to be looking at now is that this was a gradual process. I wouldn't like people looking at this as a bit of a history program to think all of these things were sorted out in a week. I mean, it took just grinding efforts, and I think the part we're particularly focusing on today is what George Mitchell was at for a long period, getting people to talk to each other, and everybody played a part. Listen, the tempers. I mean, I saw people lose their head. I saw people being totally obnoxious. I saw people flipping the lid and all that. But, I mean, they come back the following morning, they were sane again. I mean, that's the way it is in negotiations. So, I mean, it's not fair to single out anybody. And in fact, I'd like to agree with what David Andrews said earlier on, and what Jerry said. David Trimble had a hard call. I remember being with David and Liz on behalf of the Irish government, having a meeting with the Unionists party, on the Friday morning. Very tough stuff. John Taylor was there, David was there, others were there. And part of his delegation were pulling away as we were negotiating. So that was really hard. I mean, and we appreciated that. And in the end of the day, David Trimble was still standing. So, I mean, I have the height of respect for David Trimble.
For John Hume and indeed for Mark Durkin, I mean, I was talking to Seamus Mellon on Hearts and Minds last week, and he complained about the way that Sinn Féin were coddled in this process, that they seemed to get everything they wanted, and that you felt, even during that week, you felt a little sidelined.
Nope. Not during that week. The issue of the coddling.
It was a longer-term thing. I know. But you're coming to the climax of all that process.
That was post the agreement. In the week of the agreement, I mean, we were centrally involved. We were working to produce a Strand 1 agreement, because we were the only people who were putting forward submissions and ideas, and the Irish government were excluded from Strand 1. And obviously we were keeping in touch with the Irish government on those issues, clearly on the issue of Strand 2, and the Taoiseach was put into a position where big choices had to be made. the Irish government had negotiated with the British government a very good strand 2 as far as nationalists were concerned, but there was no square brackets, no italics, so there was nothing left to negotiate, and it was that as much as the content that other parties, and particularly people like John Alderdice, resented. We were trying to maintain what was in strand 2, but the Taoiseach and the Irish government had a very difficult call to make in terms of how far they could let some of that content go based on the overall balance. So we were centrally involved in all of that. The strand 1 agreement very much hinged on ourselves and the Ulster Unionist Party. I remember in the negotiations in the early hours of the morning, we had it arranged that Paul Murphy, as the chair of Strand 1, would come into the SDLP-UUP bilateral if we hadn't come out after 2 hours. It ended up going so well, I had to go out and get the word to Paul Murphy. He was not to come through the door, that we could actually clinch this and get an agreement pretty well between ourselves there and then that we thought other parties could agree to. So in all of that period, in the getting to the agreement, we were centrally involved because it was inclusive, and everybody was involved and everybody was inclusive. The things that Seamus was complaining about were afterwards, where things weren't done in an inclusive way, and they didn't always work when they weren't done in an inclusive way.
Yeah, but again, when you read the few memoirs that have been written, it's mostly about trying to placate the UUP on one side and Sinn Féin on the other side.
No, I mean, we saw the piece there about Mo Mowlam. I can remember there was one point where Tony Blair on the Holy Thursday evening said to us, and it was really aimed at John Hume, he said, I have let other people over-negotiate in this process, and it's good to do so, and I thought that meant the Irish government on Strand 2. He said, but somebody really needs to tell Sinn Féin to stop over-negotiating on these issues that they've only made submissions on this week. And if they do that, tell them I will release prisoners within a year. He said, I have been told I have a free hand on everything in this process, but Ali tells me, which was Alistair Campbell, Alistair tells me the one thing that I don't have a free hand on because it's sensitive for the British public and the tabloid press, and that's prison releases. But I will do prison releases in a year if they back off. And of course, Mo Mowlam later on, when she found out about this, because she wasn't in that conversation, when she found out later, she went ape. And her language was colourful about what was done and what Tony Blair was offering or whatever. So it wasn't that sense of things were being done just for
all right, well, let me ask for John's
Féin
perspective on that. I mean, did you feel an equal partner at this feast in that last week?
An equal partner? With who?
With Sinn Féin. Do you think that they were getting too much emphasis being put on what they wanted as opposed to what you wanted?
Well, I think that I was involved also in insisting that Sinn Féin should only be at the table if they were at the table on the same basis as other political parties, that they were totally committed to peaceful means of resolving the problem. And of course, as you know, I was heavily involved in them in getting a total end to the violence because I knew what their traditional reasons for violence were. And that whatever about the past, that those reasons didn't exist today. They asked me to prove that, and I went and got working on the Downing Street Declaration, and Albert Reynolds is here, and he was working on that as well as Taoiseach. And the Downing Street Declaration was a major step in ceasing the violence for keeps, and then creating the proper atmosphere for real talks to get a real agreement among the people. And as I also said earlier, we proposed at those talks that the last word should be with the people. And given that for the first time in history, the people of Ireland as a whole have spoken as to how they wish to live together by voting for the Good Friday Agreement, there's nothing now can undermine that agreement. And there's no doubt that we now have lasting peace, and we have a situation where there's total respect between both sections of our community, and we're working together to build a society.
Well, there's a whole issue for debate there, but I do want to bring in Jerry. You had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, again, we just need to watch how we look back on all of this. First of all, Sinn Féin negotiated in every strand, and Sinn Féin negotiated in every single issue. And we put up a whole lot of issues which had not been dealt with previous to those discussions. And you know, one of the things that I think is important, Senator Mitchell at the time said to myself, said to all of us, when we got the agreement, that's the easy bit. The hard bit is implementing it. And I think we've seen the truth of that in the last 10 years or so. So, you know, a lot of the focus is on Sinn Féin and where Sinn Féin comes at this and how we got this or how we got that. We did it, one, because we had a mandate. And we negotiated on the issues because we had a deep conviction that we were right on the issues that we were negotiating with. But to be fair to everybody who took part in those talks deserves the credit for what was achieved. We can single out individuals, of course.
Of course.
And some people played bigger parts than other people and so on. But I mean, the Good Friday Agreement was an accommodation, which came, as some of the speakers have pointed out, as part of a long and torturous process. And it's still work in progress. There's still work going on. I mean, I came out of negotiations yesterday. There's still work going on to try and make this durable and to sustain it and to deal with all of the underlying issues of inequality.
John.
I think that what Jerry says is absolutely right in focusing on how long the process was and how many aspects of it there were which people don't talk so much about. I mean, I think an important aspect of things was the forum in Dublin Castle, for example, where people began to get into discussion with each other. And this was politicians in the Republic of Ireland who hadn't been talking with Sinn Féin before that, as well as ourselves and so on. There's a whole lot of aspects to all of this without which we would not have had an agreement. And so it's very important to see that long process. The second thing is this question of trust. Trust is an outcome. It's not a prerequisite. It's an outcome of people reaching agreements and delivering them on these agreements. But there's one aspect of things which I think I can say, and George can't, but I think others will agree with me, was hugely important. One of the things that he did was led by example. And a key part of the example he gave was behaving in a respectful way with people. Because that's the one thing that you can ask of people, however much they differ, however much they disagree or whatever, you can expect people to behave respectfully. And gradually, as people watched him listening hour after hour, week after week, listening to what everybody had to say, whether he wanted to hear it or whether he didn't, he did so. And the rest of us then, I think, began to be prepared to sit and listen. If we could expect him to come and listen, then we could begin to behave in that kind of way. And I think that is also infectious. And if I may say, it's almost the opposite of what tends to happen in television studios, where the process is, can we stir up some disagreement with people
Nonsense, John.
here?
That's absolute nonsense. Sorry. Won't let you get away with that, Don. Senator, when you were leaving and were asked about writing a book about it, you said you couldn't ever write a book because the truth would be too awful. Now, you did, of course, write Making Peace, so you got over that. But that gives some idea of, I mean, you know, John says that you sat and you were polite to everyone, but you must have been thinking, what are these people like? I mean, how did you, I mean, you don't even need to answer, but I mean...
I'll make just a couple of points. On the very first day, some who were there will remember that David Irvine said to me, he said, Senator, if you are to be of any use to us, you must understand we in Northern Ireland. I said, what is it that I should understand? He said, we would drive 100 miles out of our way to receive an insult. And I thought it was a joke, but everybody in the room nodded in agreement. The second point I made was that I unwisely said on the first day, because I underestimated the length and difficulty of the task, that I told them that I'm a product of the United States Senate, which is a rule of unlimited debate. Any senator can stand up at any time and speak for as long as he or she wants on any subject, even...
Don't tell them that, for heaven's sake.
Unrelated. Well, I told them that. I said I've listed 18-hour speeches, 12-hour speeches. I've given a few 5-hour speeches myself, so I can list anything you guys can throw at me. Hundreds of times in the next 2 years I regretted making that statement.
You'll be diplomatic as ever, but I'm sure there must have been terrible times. You talked about David Irvine. Of course, again, David no longer with us, but we have a piece about the PUP leader as well.
Making peace is effectively an emotional roller coaster ride. The people of my society will have peace. Oh yeah, we'll have dark days, but we will get there. Of that I have absolutely no doubt. When I was 14 years of age, all hell broke loose. When the tensions of human rights, equality and justice exploded, to be followed by very structured, organised terrorism. At the age of 19, I became involved in that. Was subsequently arrested for possession of explosives with intent to endanger life, and went to a prison camp in Northern Ireland where I served 5.5 years. I don't advocate jail for reflection, but as sure as hell is one good place to reflect.
We are therefore entering into a new situation in a spirit of determination and confidence, determined that the injustices which created this conflict will be removed, and confident in the strength and justice of our struggle to achieve this.
We're now trying to achieve something better for our children. We intend to do that. And in being brief, I say merely, let the debate begin. We're ready for it.
They arrived just after 10 this morning, Ulster Unionists and Loyalists, just as Sinn Féin had earlier this week.
I become convinced day in, day out, that what's happening to us is not a Northern Ireland thing. It is a human thing. It is therefore, if one likes, a Bosnian thing, a Middle East thing, a Philippines thing, a Kashmir thing. We are human beings after all.
The universal ceasefire, which the Loyalists called on the 13th of October 1994, may well be amended, and they may drop the word universal. I hope that that doesn't happen, and our party will be doing everything that we can to stop any sense of violence.
After a 30-year winter of sectarian violence, Northern Ireland today has the promise of a springtime of peace.
There are now 1.7 million of us in Northern Ireland. And someday, maybe we'll give our perspective on the process of human beings moving from conflict to politics, because I think we've a lot to say, we've a lot to teach.
David Irvine. Now, David never made any secret of his paramilitary past. I remember him telling me that just a few weeks before the agreement he had been, perhaps a little longer than that, he had been engaged in nefarious activities which never came to pass, but he was engaged in planning nefarious activities. The trouble with David was, Dawn, I should ask you this, he and you were never able to bring the Loyalist paramilitaries with you. Why not?
I think we did.
Well, you had to separate yourself from them quite recently because, they weren't coming with you.
No, we haven't separated.
Well, you distanced yourself from them.
No, we haven't distanced ourselves from them at all.
All right, okay.
I think David was unique in that this was a confident, articulate voice coming from within Loyalist paramilitarism that wanted something better for the whole of Northern Ireland, and he had a vision and he had a methodology in how we get there. We still have that. We still have a lot of work to do. We still have a lot of work to do in terms of conflict transformation and transforming.
John de Chasten's still waiting for the weapons.
Yeah, well, I think it's a symptom of where we are 10 years after the Good Friday Agreement, that we still have sectarianism that is probably worse than what it was 10 years ago. But these are things that will happen. These are things that will come. I mean, no one said that building peace was going to be easy. The Good Friday Agreement was the political agreement. We're still building peace. And when the peace process and the political processes converge, we've reached it. We've got there. I think David's legacy and David's contribution has yet to be told fully, from the early 1990s up until his untimely death last year. But he was crucial for Loyalist paramilitarism. He was crucial for the peace process, and he was also crucial in terms of the Good Friday Agreement.
General, can you talk about why do you think we don't have any Loyalist guns?
Well, I can't go into details of our conversations with both of the groups, the UVF and the UDA. The UVF was the first paramilitary group to name a representative to the Commission in 1997 when we were formed.
The other two main groups, the IRA and the UDA, didn't do so until after George Mitchell's review in 1999. And we still engage with the representative, Billy Hutchinson. You're aware that the UVF made a statement some months ago to the effect that they're putting their arms beyond reach, but not with us.
Yeah.
Our work is, of course, to get them to do it with us, and we're working at that. So I would take the point that Dawn is making, because we meet with Dawn as well, that they haven't disengaged from us totally. But you're right, we haven't started on their arms yet.
Jerry Adams, a quick comment on David Irvine.
Well, I mean, it goes back a wee bit to what we were talking about earlier on, and the business about not talking and not shaking hands and not observing the civic niceties. The people who went there representing the UDP and the PUP never had any of that nonsense. They were very straightforward. When we met them, they come out and they shook hands. I remember the first time I met Gary McMichael, he stuck his hand out and shook hands. This is the man whose father had been killed by the IRA. So I think that David Irvine's role in all of this is hugely significant. And I do have to say, with the exception of the PUP, and there are others in there, that working class unionism has been very badly served for a very, very, very long time. And I think that the passing of David is a great loss, not just to that section of our people, but to all of us, for all of us.
Taoiseach?
Well, just from our part, I mean, we would not have been the natural partners in the Irish government or in our political party of Fianna Fáil of having friendship with the Loyalist movement. But I'd have to say over the years, but both the PUP with Davy Irvine, with the UDP with Davy Adams, and I mean, they were the people who were not only trying to work with us to solve the conflict. And remember, the one thing is it had to be a process, and maybe we didn't achieve that after St Andrews, but that it was an inclusive process, a process that had everybody in. And it always struck me that the Loyalist groups, were passionate not just about the issue of the peace process, but trying to find, and to this day with Dawn, we work in a constructive, non-interfering way of trying to see, I mean, what are the causes of the high unemployment and the deprivation and the things that drive people to be engaged. And that can happen in any society. I mean, we can have this problem happen in parts of my own constituency in the 70s and 80s when we had 80% unemployment. It happened in other cities. There's a bit of it to this day in Limerick, where you have to get behind problems and get into difficulty. So it wasn't unique to Loyalist Belfast, East Belfast. But I'd have to say, in my experience, Davy Irvine was somebody, as Davy Adams was, who was passionate about trying to find a way of assisting those people in their communities that they were born and reared and educated well from, and were unique in the way they were able to articulate those causes. And we in the Irish government, right through the period from Albert right through to me and on, found them very, very, very positive people.
Paul Murphy?
Yes, I always thought that if David Irvine had been born in Bradford or Birmingham or wherever it might be, he would have been a very distinguished Labour Party politician. Yeah. And I think the great thing that he brought to the talks was the experience that he had of actually living amongst working class people in Loyalist Protestant areas. And I think, you quite rightly showed us the film, and we all miss him very much, but his contribution was also very special. And as an individual, I don't think I've ever met a man who was more articulate, more committed, and more dedicated to the people he represented. But the fact that he could have been, had he been in Britain, as opposed to Northern Ireland, I think a very distinguished member of the British Parliament and in the Labour movement. And he's a great loss, I think, to Northern Ireland.
Okay, two quick comments. First, Mark. Just nice and brief, please, Mark.
Yeah, the point has been made earlier about you have the physics of negotiations, but you also need the chemistry. Yeah. David Irvine was absolutely very special in creating a chemistry within the negotiations. And it wasn't just because of his wit and articulacy. He was very straight about things as well. And he did make a real contribution to us getting to the agreement. I mean, I don't believe that we could have got the agreement we got with the Ulster Unionists in relation to Strand 1 had we not already, surprisingly, got David Irvine and the PUP on a few points in which they had reservations first. But I'll always remember the morning of Good Friday, because we were up all night negotiating. a breakfast was laid on, and it was bacon rolls in the canteen of Castle Buildings, and this was available for us.
Things you remember.
This was available at 6:30 in the morning. I remember going down to find a load of SDLP people there in the breakfast table and all eating these bacon rolls, and I said, "It's Good Friday, and that's bacon." And they all dropped the rolls. David Irvine came down later and said, "Typical, all the Catholics, you can't eat it, but you still took the bite out of it so the pros couldn't get any."
Trust is a wonderful thing. David, very quickly, please.
David was a great friend, and I think, even beyond loyalism, that I think the agreement actually mightn't have happened without his input. For me, we all know about his ability and his abilities and his articulacy. For me, it was his honesty, his integrity, and his self-deprecating humour that an awful lot of people didn't know about. But he was a fantastic guy, fantastic company.
All right. Thank you very much.
I wonder, could I add my voice to that very quickly?
Yes,
Sorry
David.
for breaking your rules. But just to say very quickly in relation to David Irvine, he was as honest as the day was long. And to paraphrase Albert Reynolds, what you saw is what you got. He came from an unusual background into the middle of a peace process, and I think he distinguished himself. And very briefly, I think that he died too young.
Okay. I want to move it along.
Well, it isn't the point strictly about David, but it's about the changing relationships between positive forces in this island. And I think a defining point, when there were big difficulties within loyalism, they went to see the Irish government. For us, that was a defining, for me anyway, that was a defining point as the positive forces in the island started to realign without giving up their principles. He didn't go to see the Brits. They didn't go to see the Ulster Unionist Party, the DUP. They went to see the Irish government.
It brings me on to something, Taoiseach, that one of the many comments that's made about your role in this is how you came to it without any baggage. Explain to us how the son of a prominent Republican, the leader of Fianna Fáil, comes to this without any baggage.
Well, obviously you have your historical perspective, but...
Sorry, let me just illuminate that. Sorry to interrupt you, but again, Jonathan Powell says in his book that he left you one night to work out Strand 2 with the Unionists, and he said they were clearly congenitally incapable of working together, just the two of them, to solve that because of the history and the baggage.
Yeah, well, I don't think we ever had any difficulty working with any of the groups, quite frankly. I think anybody would look at Fianna Fáil, where it's Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party. My father was an activist. He was a volunteer. He was a very proud volunteer, and that was the time that was in it. But I mean, where I took it up, we had the Downing Street Declaration, 15th of December 1993, which Albert had negotiated, and when it was my turn to take this on from Albert, we had to continue on to work for an inclusive process. And I understood, if anything I learned in negotiations, and in any negotiations, but particularly indeed with the peace process, is people had their objectives, they had their aims, they wanted to achieve certain things. They were all human beings, they all stood for their people, they all had their mandate, and it was for us to try to understand what everybody's position was, and ultimately we wanted to get a settlement that saw the end of trouble, that saw the end of conflict, that saw the end of mayhem that was doing so much damage to Northern Ireland, and by extension doing an enormous amount of damage to the island of Ireland. And that's where we took it, and that was our philosophy, that our contribution to this had to be deal with everybody as equal as we could. Of course, we respected the nationalist side. Of course, we had huge sympathy for the national cause. Of course, we were Republicans. But to find it wasn't any point in me going in to lecture David Trimble or lecture Ian Paisley or lecture anybody else about what our position was. It was to find an accommodation that could have an inclusive agreement that could leave the people of Northern Ireland live in harmony, work together, and by extension help the whole island of Ireland. And that was my objective every day. And of course we had to bend, we had to twist, we had to negotiate, but that's what it's about. And the chemistry built up over a long period of time. And as George said to us in that last evening on Good Friday, he said, now you've negotiated an agreement. I wish you well and good luck in its implementation. Now that took us 9 full years, and as Jerry said, he was negotiating yesterday. It'll go on for another while. But it was the painstaking commitment of each understanding each other and being able to take a fair bit of sharp tongue from each other, and there was plenty of that from all sides. But I think what I brought to it was the same as everybody else, an understanding that the end result brought us peace and harmony.
Paul Murphy, the agreement was the agreement, but there were side agreements. The Prime Minister gave assurances to Sinn Féin about the release of prisoners within a year. We never knew about that till much later. Didn't turn out to happen, but he gave that assurance. He gave the Unionists assurances that there would be exclusion mechanisms created if things weren't working out as they should for anyone who broke the code of conduct. And he also said that prisoners would not be released until it was clear that violence had been given up forever. Both of those things Unionists would claim did not happen. Those conditions were not fulfilled, but the Prime Minister, they say, reneged on those assurances. Was he just in a position at that stage where he would have given anyone any assurance just to get them all into that plenary session?
Well, it worked in the end. That's the test to it. Is that although it's
effectively telling lies to people?
No, I don't mean that. I mean that after 10 years, and we look back over a decade, ways by which you could try and move the process on, whether it was a letter here or a commitment there or a promise here or a promise there, were important in themselves to ensure that you kept the process going. And of course, when you say these things, you don't know, of course, whether these things are going to work or not at the end of the day. My own view was always...
but the point is, you don't put them in the agreement. They're side letters.
Yeah.
But they mean nothing.
Well, they meant it to the extent that there was not failure at the end of that week. And that's all, at the end of the day, that people in Northern Ireland and elsewhere wanted, was for the process to succeed. And I'm sure they wouldn't have said it, certainly not in the Prime Minister's head or anybody else's head, to lie to people or to make false promises, but rather to say that if you do these things, that's another way of trying to move this process forward. And of course, the problem with any negotiation, you say one thing to one side and the other side doesn't like it, and vice versa. But that's the nature of it. No, at the end of the day, if the outcome which we have seen in a decade is what we see today in Northern Ireland, then all those things are the right things to do.
Do you agree, Senator? And Liz?
It's human nature to dwell on differences. Generally, disagreements and controversy are news. Agreements and getting along isn't news. You have to keep in mind throughout all of this that despite the many differences that existed, which still exist and have been discussed today, there was an overwhelming common desire to end the violence and to move on to another stage. That was the view of the political leaders. It was reflecting public attitudes at the time, and that really overwhelmed and, in my judgment, ultimately triumphed over the many differences that existed, at least to the point that the agreement got imperfect and a partial step forward, nonetheless an important one.
But I know you want to come in here, Elizabeth. Maybe you could answer this question. I mean, the agreement was not as welcomed in the referendum by Unionists as it was by people in the Republic and by Nationalists. Right. And there would be a strong argument that if the Prime Minister had not given his pledges on those issues, even fewer Unionists would have voted for it. Is that a fair point?
You could make that point about 100 different things in the agreement.
But these weren't in the agreement. That's the point.
100 different things outside of the agreement. 100 different events. When you have an issue of such magnitude and such complexity, with so many individuals, so many groups, so many competing interests, you can say of many of them, if this hadn't happened, the whole thing would have collapsed. And so it's one more element in the whole process, but it's no different from all of the others.
Liz?
Yeah, just to go back to the side letters from the Prime Minister to David Trimble. I think this was part of a process of saving David, which was essential, because, and I think it's not frequently recognised, we all certainly recognise that David Trimble was under ferocious pressure. He was leading, moderate unionism, way ahead of what the constituency was prepared to go, and he had the DUP on its back, constantly. Constantly. Like Sinn Féin or any of the other parties didn't have that rejectionist opposition on its back, that political rivalry, live political rivalry in elections, against them, against their best efforts.
I think Jonathan Powell said it felt like Trimble brought his worst enemies into the negotiating room with him.
Yeah. Well, I think David Trimble deserves a lot of credit for the work he did, and I think, unfortunately, politics didn't deal him a very favourable hand. The people who took great risks, the moderate forces on nationalism and unionism, who took great risks, were not necessarily rewarded by electoral politics, but I think history will be kinder.
Reg, I'll have to let you come back. I mean, what about the side letters, the side bars, the side promises?
Well, look, this was the sort of letters that were stuffed under the door from the corridor. But look,
and written on a blackboard in pledges.
Look, I think like all of these things, you never cease to negotiate. You keep on pushing till you get absolutely the last drop you can absolutely get. Now, first of all, don't assume that everything Jonathan Powell has written in his book is accurate.
Yeah.
There are many inaccuracies in it, I can assure you.
Surely not.
But that is beside the point. The fundamental point was that we were up between a rock and a hard place that morning. And the decision was not taken until the very last minute. And other people were getting annoyed and agitated because they were having to hang on. But we were fighting what we felt for the political life of unionism, and we had to do the best we could. And the reason we had such a difficult struggle is actually exemplified by the fact that Paul Murphy admitted quite openly what we knew, that the British government wasn't fighting our corner, as some people assumed, to the same extent that the Irish government might have been fighting the nationalist corner. So we had to make as much progress as we possibly could. And overall, if you look back on it, and I know this is a period of reflection, there's 100 things we could do differently. And I would have to say this, Harry Holkery's not here, the third person who was part of the team, but George, John and Harry, the team, they have the patience of Job to actually sit and listen and deal with what they did. And this country owes them all a debt of gratitude. But I do have to say to you that overall, we have to ask ourselves why the Belfast Agreement has not yet delivered the full promise that it held at that time by a long way. I do believe that generally people are now beginning to see the value of what was done at that stage. Look around, look outside this building, look around the city. I don't think it could have happened unless we had taken the steps forward that day. And at the end of the day, it's up to the people to decide who their representatives are, but you can't be fixated by that, and you can't simply be consumed by your own sorrow at not having done better. People change their minds, and maybe they'll change them in the future.
I want to talk to Monica briefly about the role of women in this. I mean, I hate to pigeonhole you, but you were the Women's Coalition. Dawn, of course, was there. Liz was there, but otherwise we have, a room full of, a platform full of men. Great men, of course. But and there was another bit from. Sorry to quote Jonathan Powell, but it's the latest book I've read, so I know all about it. He said, in terms of the Sinn Féin delegation, he never knew whether the women were really important part of the negotiating team or just there for window dressing. So that's not for you to address. But just a word or two on the role of women in this week.
Well, I have to say it was very daunting when we walked in 1996. To the talks when we first took that risk, and I guess peace building is about risk taking. It was creative the way that those talks had been set up with 10 parties, and it was purposely set up to be inclusive. And we felt it was probably going to be the most important negotiations with two governments at the table that would ever happen. And it was as equally important for us women who had been involved in the community for the previous 30 years on many, many issues, also related to peace building, that we get to the table. When we got there, the first thing that we heard, and of course Senator Mitchell had to listen to it too, was the only woman that should be at this table should be the women who are polishing it. And there was a great deal of resentment, and at times there was an attempt to humiliate us, as you remember, Senator. But we were the ones that said we're here to talk to every party, and we won't throw our egos on the table and run out of the room. And the difference between us, and I was listening to a little bit of revisionism here today, which is fine in hindsight, was that we were prepared to go out and talk to the PUP. David Irvine and Billy were strangers to us in the Women's Coalition, and many people in Sinn Féin were too. We got labelled very early on as being in cohorts with murderers. Sinn Féin in skirts, all kinds of, humiliating terms were brought it down on our heads. But we said, look, that's more about them than it is about us. Let's focus on the negotiations. When Senator Mitchell asks us for papers and homework, be prepared to share those. Be prepared to talk to every party. And what struck me, two things about the negotiations, was that many people remained strangers to each other even at the end of the talks. So human relationships hadn't really been built in the way that they should have. And also in those last weeks, even though we'd been there for 2 years, too many people were still bringing problems to the table and not solutions. And I remember us taking ourselves off and trying to work out what made for good negotiators, which was to try and figure out what would work and what would build consensus and bring some problem solving to the table. And we did the best we could. I was very proud to be a signatory 10 years ago on Good Friday. I guess not only did we get sidelined, we'd put forward the view that we should all stay together. I was very conscious, like domestic violence, that when women leave the relationship, it can be a very dangerous time for them, and that we should try to stay together as an implementation committee. Bigger parties told us, no, forget that, throw it out, and I think that was a shame. But we were prepared to go back into the communities again and start to do what we knew best, which was to build peace from the bottom up.
Sinn Féin in skirts, I'm not sure whether that's a compliment or an insult. Jerry Allen, what about the role of your...
Clearly a compliment.
Women negotiators.
Well, first of all, I mean, John just said to me, I wouldn't say that Rita O'Hare was there for window dressing. Siobhan O'Hanlon, who also sadly has died since, Barbara de Bruyn, Lucilla Brannock. I mean, a lot of the tedium, a lot of the detail in some of this, it was Barbara de Bruyn that took our team through this. So there are two... there are all the sort of tiers of negotiations, of negotiating with the governments, of negotiation with the other parties, negotiating with your own team. And then there is the political call. But before you get to the point, and I'm sure people will agree with this, before you get to the point where there's a political call, people have to go through the minute detail, the minutiae of the documents. And our team, and those women I have named, did that admirably well and did a very, very good job.
We're running out of time, as I knew we would. We have a lot of young leaders of the future in the audience here from both sides of the Atlantic. John Hume, I wonder if you might give us, or give them, some advice on the qualities of political leadership. I mean, you took a lot of flack right through the process, from starting to talk to Sinn Féin. People were on your back a lot of the time. What advice would you give young people about political leadership and taking important steps?
Well, it's a very difficult question. My advice to young people is, of course, that if they're getting involved in politics, then they're obviously going to be involved with some political party, and that they should understand fully and clearly what the objectives of that party are and how they're going to achieve those objectives. And, of course, given that we are a divided society, and that division goes to the heart of our problems, that one of the challenges put to the younger generation is that their generation would be the generation that would break down those barriers, and that we would move into a society where politics would be normal and not be divided as we are in the past on religious basis.
Yeah. Senator, political leadership, what qualities do these people need to develop, these young people?
Well, I assume you're talking about democratic societies.
Yes. I don't know if any of you want to become dictators. No.
Open election processes. Well,
that would be nice.
It's a very important distinction.
Yes, of course it is.
Every political leader, elected leader, constantly faces a never-ending tension between the demands of one's immediate constituency and the needs of the larger society. Nowhere was that more evident than in Northern Ireland at the time of the conflict, where you had sharply divided societies, where while there was a common objective, which was get it done, it was conveyed with another message, is get it done our way, and the two ways were different. And in the end, you have to use your own judgment and conscience to do what's best for the larger society. It's very common in democratic societies, certainly here in the UK and Ireland and the US, with which we're now most immediately familiar, to ridicule, demean political leaders, and much of it is well earned. But I think on the whole, the political leaders here on the stage from the UK and Ireland, and specifically the political leaders of Northern Ireland, demonstrated at a critical juncture in their society's history a great deal of courage and leadership. So if you want examples of courageous political leadership, I would say look at the men and women on this stage and others who've been mentioned here who are not here this evening for acting for the common good at a critical stage in their history. And I'll make one final point. It's important to look back and recognize what happened 10 years ago, but it's even more important to do two other things. To recognize that it was not an isolated event. It was part of a long historical process that in its modern version covers a 40-year period and is still going on as we speak right now, and will go on for a very long time. And it will be necessary that the people of Northern Ireland elect political leaders who have this, at crucial moments in history, have the same courage and vision and foresight which all of these leaders, all human, all imperfect, all with failings, but at the critical moment in history, they did the right thing.
Taoiseach, you took the step recently of falling on your sword for the greater good, so not to deflect, you said, from the business of politics in the Republic, but what would your advice on leadership be to these young people?
Well, I think first of all to young people, it's to understand that the business of politics and the profession of politics is a very noble profession. It's a good profession. It's a profession where you can actually change things. You can make society better, you can make your community better, you can make your country better. And there's not any other task that you can really do that's better than that. Of course, like any difficult profession, it has its ups and downs, but I think that's irrelevant. It's the same if you're in the financial business this last 7 or 8 months and all the difficulties of subprime, that's a difficult business. If you're in public administration, there's difficult times in that too. But I think in politics as a career, and it is important for the rising generation that more and more good people, like a lot of your audience tonight, who are people who worked very hard to attain for themselves really high standard of education, that they do look and consider being actively involved in politics, whether it's as an elected person or a person that is supporting a political movement of whatever kind. And I just hope more and more people do that, because the world needs men and women who will dedicate themselves to playing the part in politics. And my experience is that there is no profession, and people in this platform this evening are typical examples of it. Nobody works harder. The people that you have here as your guests this evening are people who I've watched with for the last 15 years, who put in an enormous amount of personal effort, dedication to try to achieve one principle, that they could all live in a more peaceful society. And it's the same around the world, and around the world people need young people to play their part in that.
Let me pick up on that point. We have very few minutes left, so I'd just like to ask, first 4 people put their hands up, I suppose. You don't even know what the question is yet.
Stop me giving an answer.
Many people come here to look at what happened here. I was talking to Tony Blair this week about his work in the Middle East. What do you think are the lessons, if any, other than, or are they only superficial, facile lessons that can be learnt for the rest of the world in other conflicts from what we've been through? Go on.
Dialogue. Yeah. And just remember, folks, success has many parents. Just remember that. Failure is an orphan. So what you need is dialogue, and dialogue includes proactive listening and inclusivity.
Okay, David.
I think we have to be very open about it. I think we're a bit self-obsessed more than a bit self-obsessed in Northern Ireland. So while there are lessons to be learnt, and dialogue is quite right, as Jerry points out, I don't think we want to run away with the idea that we have produced some sort of blueprint here that can be carried around the world and solve all the systems. All conflicts are very, very different and have different dynamics and all the rest of it. So let's not run away with the idea that we're, we have a blueprint here that'll help the rest of the world necessarily.
Yeah, our model of a solution won't necessarily work for everyone else, but there are key principles that apply. First of all, we all need to realise that we can't really be secure against each other. We can only really be secure with each other. We can't prosper against each other. We can only prosper with each other. And in terms of negotiations and political processes, people need to realise that you can't get a solution without the people that you have deep differences with, and you can't get a solution against the people that you have deep differences with. You need to get it with them, and you need to get it for them. And if you approach it in that way, and if you implement it in that way, you will have success.
Please.
In terms of process, I think a permanent secretariat is a very good, important aspect of successful peace processes. To have, we had Senator Mitchell over a long period of time giving a commitment to a process, and we had civil servants of the highest calibre from the British and Irish governments and the Northern Ireland office, really committed on a permanent basis to finding solutions, working up documents and all the rest of it. So I think in terms of process, that's an important thing. The second thing I would say, in terms of, to pick up Jerry Adams' point in dialogue, respectful dialogue, no matter what people have done. And in wars and conflicts, people do terrible things. Because of the depravity of human nature and that comes out in conflict, that you have to treat your enemy with respect if you want to make peace with them.
Okay, John.
I've spent a lot of time, as you know, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in Latin America. And the thing that came across to me in every one of these situations where there's long-standing conflict is that there's a group of people that believe they've been treated with disrespect and humiliated. There are broken relationships, and it's fundamentally about people and relationships that have to be built and repaired. It's not just about politics and the fights over borders and economies. It's about people. And if you forget that, you'll never be able to take things forward.
John, briefly.
Well, briefly, when you study conflict, you find that conflict, no matter where it is, it's about difference, whether difference of race, difference of religion, or difference of nationality. And therefore one of the very important points to get across, particularly to young people, is that difference is an accident of birth. No one chose to be born into any community. Therefore it's not something we should fight about. Now, that sounds very simple, but in fact when you look at conflicts, that's what they're about. And if you can get total respect for difference, then you can create a world in which there is much more peace.
Sorry, Paul.
Yeah, exactly what John was saying is respect certainly for each other as politicians, but also at a time when there is a huge amount of disrespect for the business of politics. Remember that this was a political agreement, and that what's happened in Northern Ireland was agreed by politicians in a political context. And if we can have that as a lesson, I think that's a hugely important one.
And the last word will have to be to Sir Reg.
Well, making peace is one thing, maintaining it for the long term is the other. And here's where the young people come in. Because we've made many mistakes in our generation and those before us. I'm glad that there are many of them here today, many of them prepared to participate in politics. You don't carry the baggage with you that we have. You can learn from our mistakes. And if we've done anything, is lay a bit of a foundation to correct some of the mistakes we've made in the past. But it'd be up to the next generation. Please participate. Absolutely. Never mind the stuff that's in the press. At the end of the day, decisions are either taken by democratically elected people or they're taken by people like Mugabe. Now, I think we've got to make up our minds. Democracy we treat very cheaply in the Western world, but there's millions of people across the world are crying out for the opportunity who can't even get the election result of an election that took place nearly a fortnight ago. That's the contrast. You have the choice, and I hope those of you who are here have made it.
Sir Reg, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is 6 o'clock. Our time is up. On behalf of the US-Ireland Alliance, I'd like to thank you all very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen, for giving us the time and the insights that you have this afternoon. We've hardly scratched the surface, but I hope we have given you some food for thought. And as we mark this 10th anniversary, maybe some of you will be looking forward to taking up your own lives in politics on either side of the Atlantic. come on the Hearts and Minds and tell me all about it. It's my great pleasure to be your host and your interlocutor today. Thank you very much again. And I'll not be at the dinner tonight. I have to go and make a programme. But I'm sure it'll be a great dinner. Many reminiscences. And get home safe and sober. Thank you very much indeed.